Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Nice crowd out this evening to hear a little history. Before we get started, just a few announcements on upcoming events. A lot going on as usual. Next Tuesday, we have the Museum Association's annual meeting. So all of the members out there in the crowd, please join us for that. That is at 6 p.m., I believe. Membership, if you're not a member, please grab a brochure. It's a great way to stay up to date on what's going on and, of course, support us in putting on programs just like this. October 10th, we've invited back the Raptors from the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. So we will have an owl, a hawk, and I believe an American kestrel are going to be here. So bring your kids and grandkids and come and see the birds on October 10th. The Museum Association's Fall Festival is October 18th and 19th out at Central Pavilion at Camplex. Also October 18th, Lee Silliman, the curator of the Hurrah for the Cowboy exhibit back here. He's going to be here and do two programs. He's going to do a lunch and learn at noon about the history of the wild horse. And then at 7 p.m., he's going to talk about the history of the American cowboy. So you join us twice that day if you can. That is October 18th. And then, of course, November 11th, Veterans Day, we're going to be in the parade, and then Greg Bennick is going to do another history tour at Mount Pisgah Cemetery at 2 p.m. So don't miss that. And more to come. So please stay in tune with us at our website, rockpilemuseum.com, and on social media. But without further ado, our speaker tonight is Mr. Mark Warren. He is a graduate of the University of Georgia. He has researched the American West for more than 60 years. He lectures on Native American history and survival skills and Western frontier history, presenting at museums and cultural centers around the country. He is a member of the Wild West History Association, the Historical Novel Society, and the Western Writers of America. His Wyatt Earp, An American Odyssey trilogy was honored by the Western Writers' Spur Awards, the Historical Novel Society, and the Will Rogers Medallion Awards. In 2022, Warren was a Georgia Author of the Year recipient for his book, Song of the Horseman. Indigo Heaven and the Western Trail Travesties are both Will Rogers Medallion Award winners. Warren's latest works, A Last Serenade for Billy Bonney, and a duology on Nate Champion, Nate the Texas Story and Nate the Wyoming Story, are available for purchase everywhere books are sold, as well as here tonight. So after the talk, please get over there and check out the books. Please help me welcome Mr. Mark Warren.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you tonight. Thanks for coming. The story I'm going to tell you tonight is one you may find very hard to believe. The historian T.A. Larson said about this story, "It is the most notorious event in the history of Wyoming." Another historian, Christopher Knowlton, said, "This is the Watergate of Wyoming." And that is an understatement. By the 1880s, by the middle of the 1880s, the buffalo had just about been exterminated from the Great Plains. Whether you knew this or not, you might find this of interest. Part of that extermination was promoted by the U.S. government. Buffalo hunters were actually paid for getting their ammunition free. They wanted the buffalo gone because that was the way that the Native American would be defeated. There were 3 million buffalo. And in a decade and a half, it was reduced to 300 before somebody thought to start saving them. But with the range now void of buffalo, the grass was now available for another animal. And this animal's story begins in Spain. The Spanish brought this animal here as a walking food supply as the conquistadors traveled through the Southwest in search of treasures, such as gold. And many of these longhorns were stolen by the native people. Some simply got away. So they became feral animals all over the Southwest. In Texas alone, there was said to be 8 million right after the Civil War. Now think about it. During the Civil War, all of the males of age had gone east to fight for the Confederacy, leaving behind females to deal with the ranches and home life. And the feral longhorns proliferated. There was nothing there to control their numbers, and that's why it got so high. Somebody had a bright idea when they got back from the war, and after that, the economy of Texas was ruined, and these people were having to tolerate the idea of Reconstruction. Someone had a great idea for an enterprise. If we could gather up these animals and get them to the east, where there's so much population of people, we could make a fortune with this. So here becomes the birth of the famous cattle drive. Most people know of this cattle driving as taking animals to Kansas, because that was the closest route to get to the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad had completed across the continent. And every time that a spur came down south from that, it ran through Nebraska. And when a spur came down into Kansas, that spot where a town grew up and became the cattle town. One of the first was Abilene, for example. So that's where cattle went. But there was another place where cattle needed to be driven. And this is something that a lot of people forget in our history. And that is to the forts that are spread all over the West, and the reservations for the Native Americans that were always nearby the forts. Both of these were promised foods from the government. Soldiers had to eat. Native Americans on the reservation had to eat. This is a drawing of the fort that was located where Buffalo is now, Buffalo, Wyoming, Fort McKinney. And here's a photograph of that fort. Anytime that a fort was established somewhere, a settlement grew up outside of the fort to serve the fort. And that usually meant houses of prostitution, saloons, and gambling parlors, and drug dens. So it was a pretty seamy side of our culture, but that would evolve into a town. And Buffalo got quite a reputation as being a town of very ambitious and industrious people. There were many newspaper articles written about the citizens here, how upstanding they seemed. And it grew to be quite a town on Clear Creek, which ran into the Powder River. Cattle drivers who came up to Wyoming to deliver cattle to these forts, many of them Texans, saw Wyoming for the first time. Now I can relate to that. I'm sure that many of you were born here. But those of you who might have come into this area and saw it for the first time, think back to your reaction. It won a lot of people's hearts, and they wanted to stay here. There was another resource of tremendous value here, and that's all the grasslands. One of the cowboys who came up from Texas was a 23-year-old young man named Nate Champion. He was a slight fellow, smaller than I am. He was well known for being forthright, friendly, honest, and someone you did not cross. You did not do him wrong, because he would not back down. His father had been the sheriff of Williamson County, Texas. Turns out a lot of people from that county came right up here to Johnson County. Nate comes from a big family, 18 siblings. Now his mother died when he was a very young age, at 4. But His father remarried so that the family kept growing. And Nate came up to Wyoming with two of his younger brothers. And I want to read you something that was in the Buffalo Bulletin, the newspaper, about Nate. It was an unsolicited little article. And this is what it reads. No man who knows Nate Champion would not swear by him. His reputation among men has always been the very best. What if the newspaper came out with your name in those sentences? That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Like all the other cowhands who came up here, Nate went to work for one of the large landowners who was, I shouldn't say landowners, I should say one of the large cattlemen. The reason I corrected myself there is at this time, Nate arrived here in 1880. As late as 1878, almost all of the Wyoming Territory was government owned, which means it was free range. Free range means that you have the pleasure of using this land with your livestock, but you do not own it. You cannot fence it in. You can't keep another person from coming in there. The only people who were already here with cattle were people who were wealthy and had brought in lots of money for the cattle industry. Here are a few of them. Horace Plunkett was an Englishman who hated Westerners. He could not stand the people who worked for him until he met Nate Champion. And Nate became a foreman for him. And he had a completely different attitude about Nate. I think one of the things that Mr. Plunkett objected to mostly was the profanity that went along with being a cowboy. Morton Fruin came from England with his brother, and their purpose in coming here was to trophy hunt in the Yellowstone country. And when he saw the Powder River Basin, the dollar signs went off in his mind, and he wanted to start a cattle industry here. He just saw that this was too rich an area. The streams that poured off the east side of the Bighorns and fed all this pasture land caused him to bring in a huge herd of cattle. The last man there, I want you to remember his name and his face. His name's going to come up a few times during this talk. Fred Hesse. He was born in Essex. Now, how he differs from these two men is that he came from a poor family. These men were born into their wealth. Now, Hesse, like many people in Europe, read about the cowboy life and was hooked. He wanted to be a cowboy. He came to Texas to work as a cowboy. He started off as one of the good old boys who worked on a horse. But as he turned out, when Fruin came here, because he was English, because they were both English, they had a connection. They both loathed the American cowboy. So Hesse became the foreman for Fruin's herd. And Hesse's whole attitude would be violent and vicious, as you'll see as this story goes. The cattle industry here, as it was begun by these cattle barons, was doomed. And here's why. They considered all the free range to be theirs simply because they were there first. They'd spent years there. If you get into their minds, you can see why they would begin to think this way. Even though they knew they were wrong. But they were practicing what I think are the three perfectly human qualities that we constantly see throughout history. The greed was there to build the herds much larger than they ought to be. They could rationalize it away, like we all do with things that we need to settle in our minds. And they had no foresight about what could happen with their mistakes. That's the myopia. That to me is another basic human trait that gets us into so much trouble. Myopia, I believe, is what has led our planet into so much environmental problems. Plunkett's herd was called the Bar-C. And Nate would meet a lot of his friends on the Bar-C because of that, because he was the foreman there. All of the free range eventually came up for settlement. In 1862, there was an act passed called the Homestead Act. Anyone could claim 160 acres of land of that free range, and they paid for it. They have to live on it a certain amount of time. They have to build a domicile on it. It is theirs. They could then fence that in if they want to. But only people who follow those criteria can fence in the property. It has to be their property. And where are you going to put your ranch if you're a settler? You're going to have a small herd. You're going to look around at all the grazing land, and you are bound to choose a piece right next to a stream, aren't you? You've got to have water for your herd. So as more settlers came in, this started locking up access to the water. And the cattle barons couldn't take their cattle through the private land to get to the water. So this was one of the things that really put a burr under the saddle of the rich cattle barons. They could see how this was going, and they needed to do something to prevent all this. What they did was to form an organization called the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. It is still in operation. And all I'm going to tell you about the Stock Growers Association tonight refers to their history, not how they are today. The Stock Growers Association was centered in Cheyenne, and all of the men who were members of it were also members of an elite club called the Cheyenne Club. And they were extremely rich. They had a lot of money to pour into any projects that they wanted to start. And listen to the connections they had politically. In their group was the territorial treasurer, the territorial governor, 3 U.S. senators, and the attorney general for the territory. These are all part of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. So they had a lot of political pull. They could get laws passed, as you'll see soon. One of the first things they did was to fence off land that they did not own. They'd been on it a long time, they'd used it a long time, and so they felt that they owned it. And they didn't feel that a newcomer had the right to come on that land. In fact, the newcomer did have that right. Putting up fencing like this was illegal. But because the association had most of the law officers and most of the government in their pocket, they could break the law like this and get away with it, never be taken to court for it. The Stock Growers Association had one more tool that it used, a very dangerous one. They were called stock detectives, but they were hired assassins. If you've ever heard the story of Tom Horn, then you know something about the assassin that was hired to take care of the small ranchers. Frank Canton was perhaps the most famous simply because he lived through all this and he wrote a book about himself. Now, this is a modern book written about him by a historian alive today who revealed his entire true history. Frank Canton made up his name. He was from Texas. He would even be elected sheriff in Johnson County just within a couple of years after getting here. But first he worked for the Stock Growers Association. When he became sheriff, he still was working as an agent for the Stock Growers Association. In reality, his name was Joe Horner from Texas. And let me tell you a little about his past. These are the crimes that he committed. He threatened the life of a lawman. He robbed the post office. He was arrested for aggravated assault and battery. He was arrested for cattle theft. He murdered a black soldier. He robbed a bank. He broke out of jail. He was caught. He escaped again. He was caught. He escaped again. This time he was caught, indicted, convicted, and sent to the prison in Comanche, Texas. And he escaped again. And that's when he went to Wyoming and made up a brand new life. Frank Kenton was a man who had no qualms about taking a life. He had very mean eyes. Everyone who ever met him talked about his eyes. Very hard man. The stock growers' influence with the legislature put out a brand new law called the Maverick Law. And the law said that if anyone found a calf on the plains that was not claimed by anyone, it could only be claimed by a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. If you were a small settler somewhere and you were not a member of that, you had no rights to that calf. And if you took it, you were a rustler. This was the beginning of a strange use of the word rustler. We all know what rustler means, but in this case, it simply meant, eventually, anyone who was not a member of the Stock Growers Association. That's all you had to be in order to be labeled a rustler. One such man who was labeled a rustler was Jack Flagg. This is Jack Flagg right here. He was from West Virginia. He came to be a Texas cowboy, just like Fred Hesse did. And when he came to Wyoming, he fell in love with the area, and he became a small rancher. He was very robust and outspoken, a handsome man, very large man. That picture doesn't look it, does it? But the history books say he was. And he was very erudite. He had had a good education. So he began writing newspaper articles protesting against the monopoly of the cattle barons. Jack Flagg was one of the first people to be put on a list, it was called the Black List, by the Stock Growers Association, and he was the #1 rustler, simply because he was the most outspoken man. Another close friend of Nate's was a young man named Sumner Beach. There is no photograph of him that we have, but this is a photograph, a facsimile, not his cabin, but this is his dream. This is what he wanted on Deer Creek in the Sweetwater Basin. So he and his partner, who had been working for a man named Walcott, and I'll tell you more about Walcott, decided to go it on their own. So they took out one of those claims. They called it in those days taking out a patent on land. So they got their 160 acres on Deer Creek. And they went up to the slopes to cut timber, dragged it back down, stripped the bark off, and they were seasoning these logs to build a cabin. And they went into town to get some supplies, and when they came back, all the logs were gone and there were drag marks going into Deer Creek. The man they had once worked for, Frank Walcott, had hired his men to go drag those logs away, get rid of them. He was not going to allow these men to live there on the creek that he used for watering his herds. So What does Sumner Beach do? He doesn't do what most people do. Walcott had already burned out one man and forced the man out of the territory. Sumner Beach was not going to leave. He was a Nate Champion type fellow. So he started cutting timber again. This time Walcott, his ex-employer, sent over an assassin. And it happened to be a man who had once worked with Sumner Beach and with Nate Champion on the Bar C in Johnson County. So Sumner knew this fellow, but he didn't trust him. Finally, when this assassin decided to make his play and get rid of Sumner, Sumner was alert about it. He was already suspicious that he was too quick for the man and killed him in self-defense. So Walcott had a warrant sworn out for Sumner Beach, taken to jail, and then Walcott had himself appointed Justice of the Peace to hear the trial. That's about the very opposite of a judge recusing himself. So Sumner had to stand trial. And at this point, something interesting happened. We don't know who did this, but someone put out a pamphlet and they titled it The Jack of Spades. And what it was a revealing of Frank Walcott. This is the man who had been Sumner's employer. He had quite a background. And the Jack of Spades pamphlet told it all. And here it was. In the Civil War, he was a major. After the war, for the rest of his life, he insisted on being called the Major. After the war, President Grant appointed him as a U.S. Marshal and then as the warden of the prison outside of Laramie. Sounds like a pretty good resume, doesn't it, for your next job? Well, he was kicked out of both. And let me read to you the quotes of why he was kicked out. Here were the charges: embezzling money, being obnoxious, overbearing, hateful, abusive, insolent, dishonest, corrupt, and disgraceful. That's what was written down on the documents about his dismissals. He bribed land agents to pretend that he had already made a claim on land that new settlers were making claims on. So you can see these fingers just reached far out into all of the judicial system and into the church. It took 15 minutes to find him not guilty of murder. And that was the fun thing about this time in history in Johnson County. You couldn't rig a jury. I mean, juries had to be picked up from the citizens. And the citizens slowly became aware of the monopoly that the barons exercised over the territory. And so if the barons successfully got someone into court, it was usually the jury that would always let the citizens go, the people who were not part of the cattle barons. So there's something more coming, though, that's more dangerous than assassins and more dangerous than the egomaniacs who were in charge like this. And that was the winter of 1886 and 87. An incredible storm, high snow drifts, bitter temperatures that dropped to 60 degrees below zero. It had been a very dry, hot summer. The grass was not in good shape. The barons had always had it in their mind that there was so much pasture land here that they never had to worry about any kind of emergency foods. Well, the grass was in bad shape. No one had collected hay for the winter if it was needed. Hay was brought all the way over from Nebraska in some cases, and it was very expensive to do that. But most people could not afford that. This winter was devastating. Half of the cattle Wyoming perished, froze to death. You know, cattle don't have the ability to get down to grass underneath the snow like buffalo do. So it was a death sentence for these cattle. Many outfits went under, out of business. Many small ranchers called it quits and left the area. They were replaced by tougher people who stayed. So this was a real watershed moment in the history of Wyoming Territory. Let's see what that number was. Hundreds of thousands of cattle died. Hundreds of thousands. And can you imagine what you would discover in the spring after the storm? Going out onto the prairie and what you would see there. Probably somewhat similar to the Native Americans finding a buffalo slaughtered, where the buffalo were found with just their tongues and their humps and their skins missing, and everything else was left to rot. That would have been a very similar experience for the cattle barons. There was one case in particular that you may have heard of. This woman was put down in history as being called Cattle Kate. Ever heard that term, anybody? Cattle Kate was a made-up name for her. She was a very good-hearted Scotswoman who came down from Canada. And she met this man, Jim Averill, who was from Wisconsin. They fell in love and decided to live together. They decided not to marry right away because they wanted to get 2 patents of land. And then once they married, they would combine them. Jim Averill was a very educated man. And like Jack Flagg, he began writing newspaper articles condemning the cattle barons who were dominating the free range. The rumor was that Ella Watson was a prostitute and that Jim Averill was her pimp, and that they were paid for her services in cattle. That was a completely made-up story to put them in a bad light. A neighbor of theirs had had enough of them, and he gathered up 5 of his friends, and he took Jim Averill and Ella Watson down to Spring Canyon and hung them by the neck and left them there, their bodies turned black. He wanted all people to see them. This was the neighbor who did that. Albert Bothwell. This was a hanging that was not a typical hanging of having the neck broken. That's a quick ordeal. This was a strangulation because there was not enough room to drop to break a neck. They simply hoisted him up and let them asphyxiate. So this is a representative of the Stockbrokers Association. It's more of the powerful, wealthy people behaving as they want to behave in order to get what they want. There were 3 witnesses who saw Jim Averill and Ella Watson kidnapped from their place and taken out to that canyon to be hanged. Several of these were young boys that Ella had taken in because they were having a hard time with their own families. That's the kind of person she was. One other young man who worked for Jim Averill raced after this kidnapping wagon, and when he caught up with him, he saw his friend Jim and Ella being hung. And he put up a fight, tried to stop it, but he had a pistol and no extra ammunition, so he couldn't hold out on his own. He was overpowered by them, and he had to make a run for it. But he was a witness. So that's 3 boys at home, and this young man that followed them, 4 witnesses altogether. When it went to trial, there were no witnesses. 3 of them had simply disappeared. No one knew where they were. And 1 had died, and the consensus was that it was a death by poison. In 1889, Wyoming becomes a state. Nate Champion's been working for a lot of outfits, and he gets into trouble because he, as a foreman, he accepts small ranchers into the roundup. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association became livid at this. And remember Fred Hesse? Fred Hesse is the one who engineered this, that Nate Champion should be blacklisted now and thrown out of the bar seat where he worked. So Nate was on his own, and he managed to buy up 150 head of cattle. He didn't own land, he didn't have a claim yet, but he ran them out in the hole-in-the-wall country. A real interesting terrain out there, that you've got this long wall of rock and a real wide meadow between it. It's a very linear pasture, and then you've got redstone cliffs here. It's a long 30-mile stretch, a beautiful place to run cattle, and plenty of room, to rotate where you're letting your cattle graze. So Nate is out this way, and this is the first place where he runs into an altercation with this man, Mike Chauncey. He is a foreman, a cowboy. He works for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association as a spy. He gives the association information about small ranchers that can give them evidence to get them behind bars or thrown out or run out of the territory. Chauncey was running cattle in the hole-in-the-wall country, and some of the cattle in his herd got mixed up with Nate's herd. Now Chauncey's working for one of the senators, U.S. senators, who runs a herd out here. So Nate goes over to Chauncey and says, some of my cattle are mixed in with yours. I'm going to get them out. Is that okay with you? Chauncey says, oh, don't worry about it. I'll get them out in just a few minutes. Just give me some time and I'll send them over to your place where you're gathered with your herd. So time went by and those cattle never showed up. So Nate went back to check on it, and Chauncey had simply driven them off into the hills, making it hard for Nate to get them back. So Nate gave him a piece of his mind right in front of his crew. It shamed Chauncey. Chauncey was very embarrassed about it, but he didn't do anything. Even though he had his whole crew behind him there, he didn't do anything aggressive toward Nate Champion. And I suspect that's because what he could read from Nate Champion's demeanor. Nate knew he was in the right. That's all a man like Nate needs. Chauncey had already been flogged in public by Jack Flagg. Remember that guy? He was the first one on the blacklist. And Flagg beat him with a quirt. Very embarrassing situation. Once again, Chauncey just took it and did not fight back. One of the members of the WSGA, Wyoming Stock Growers Association, Willis Van Devanter. This man was the territorial Supreme Court justice. He would be, in the future, a U.S. Supreme Court justice. So he's got quite a political stature. He decided to put a spy into Nate Champion's crew, not Chauncey. That would be a dead giveaway to Nate. But the spy he sent there spent months with Nate Champion and came back and said, there's nothing to report. This guy lives on the level. So Devanter was forced to put out this statement to the Stock Growers Association. This is a statement that's in print on a document. There is absolutely no proof of any kind against him, meaning Nate Champion, not even that he stole a calf. Jack Flagg and several of his friends who were small ranchers tried to ship cattle off for sale. Fred Hesse, the young Englishman that I ask you to remember that name because you'd be hearing it a lot. Fred Hesse had now become the head of a brand new organization that the stock growers had invented, and it was called, let's see, the Northern Wyoming Protective Association. So basically it's an agency of the Stock Growers Association. He intercepts the sale of cattle, claiming that all these are stolen cattle. He stops the sale. And he says that every one of these cattlemen who's brought cattle here are now on the black list. They are rustlers. At this same time, Nate is still working near Hole in the Wall, and he has moved into a cabin that does not exist anymore. So again, this is a facsimile, just to have you something to look at while I'm telling you about it. This is the closest picture I could find that's the correct size for the cabin. It was quite small. And Nate was living here with one crew member named Ross Gilbertson. And Nate's cattle were in this general area. And one night, while Nate and Ross stayed in this cabin, they were sleeping. Their only other companion was a cat. Little did they know that 5 men working for the Stock Growers Association, all of them stock detectives, assassins, were nearby planning an assault on this cabin to kill Nate Champion. What they wanted to do was capture him and hang him and leave his body as a statement to anybody else, as a threat. About dawn, Nate had awakened, he was stroking the cat, and he fell back asleep. The next thing that he heard was the door opening. The cabin was so small that the door wouldn't open all the way. It hit the bed. And that woke Nate up. And the first thing he heard was somebody yelling, "All right, boys, we got you this time. Give it up." Nate said, "Who is it? What do you want?" He had no idea what was going on. And then he saw that the man trying to get through the crack in the door was holding a gun and pointing it at him. Nate pretended a stretch and a yawn. He had his gun belt hooked on the bedpost. And he pulled his gun, and that's when things started happening fast. 2 shots were fired. The man in the doorway fired at Nate, missed Nate's head. Nate's face was covered with powder burn. It's a wonder that he could even see to make his shot. His shot struck home. And so now these men who were trying to crowd into this cabin to capture these men, now they were falling all over themselves trying to get out of there. They dropped their weapons and ran for it. Nate, in his long johns, took his pistol, stepped outside to see what was happening. And he saw men running away. And one of the men trying to get away, who was in the back, was barely able to hobble away because he was holding his belly where he'd been shot. While Nate picks up a gun and recognizes the rifle as Frank Canton. Remember him? The fellow who had changed his name from Joe Horner, who had been an outlaw and now was a detective for the stock growers. It was his rifle. Nate picked it up to have better accuracy for the shots he was about to fire, and out from the side of the cabin around the corner steps one of these assassins holding a rifle himself. And Nate didn't know the man, but he saw it very well. And so later he was able to identify who he was. It was a man named Joe Elliott who was a stock detective. Before Elliott could fire, Nate jumped back into the cabin, and then Elliott took off. So that was the first attempt on Nate Champion's life. He and Ross Gilbertson got dressed and started tracking these guys, and they found where they had crowded together before they came on for the assault. And there were 4 overcoats stacked in a pile. These men were in a hurry to get away. They dropped 2 rifles and left their coats. They had their horses there. And so Nate and Ross decided, instead of us tracking 5 horsemen, let's get some help. Ross Gilbertson really didn't want to be involved, so he bowed out. Nate rode over to the Red Fork of the Powder to gather friends of his. Let me show you one of those friends. John Tisdale grew up with Nate in Round Rock, Texas, Williamson County. John was probably one of the most respected men in the county because he was so well educated. He was one of the few around there to go to college. When he finally left home, he went to the Dakota Territory and he served as a foreman to a man named Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt gave John a high chair for his child as a gift. John Tisdale and his wife and family, 2 children, decided to come over and join John's half-brother, who was a friend of Nate's, living on the Red Fork of the Powder. So John Tisdale was one of the men who agreed to come with Nate. Another was a friend of Nate's who had worked with him at the Bar C, whose name was Ranger Jones. So they go with Nate and with Nate's younger brothers, and they track these horses, and the timing of this just couldn't have been better. Let me tell you first what happened that Nate didn't know about. These attackers had come in on horseback, but they had left behind a fresh string of horses so that they could come back and do a relay and take off and have the advantage on anybody chasing them. They were being very careful about making sure they got away safely. Well, they left their first string of horses where the others had been tied, and they left. They sent Chauncey, Mike Chauncey, remember the spy? They sent him back to retrieve these horses that they had tied up closer to Nate's cabin. And Nate and his little posse arrived at the very moment when Chauncey was there getting those horses. So Chauncey was scared to death now. And Nate pulled a very clever trick on him. He said, I already know who attacked me that morning. And I want you to tell me their names out loud. And if you lie to me, I will kill you. So Chauncey spilled it out. He gave all the names of the people. So keep in mind that within hearing range of that is John Tisdale and Ranger Jones. And the reason I want you to remember that is because within this same month when Nate was attacked, John Tisdale was ambushed and shot from behind and killed. Ranger Jones, again, we don't have a picture of Ranger, but the same thing happened to him. When John Tisdale was shot, he was coming back from Buffalo, driving his wagon, and in his wagon were the Christmas presents for his children. And a dog. His dog. His dog was killed too. Because the dog tried to follow the killer. The killer was Frank Kenton. So now, we know why these men were ambushed and killed. Because when Nate took this to court, he would have these men to back him up. So Nate Champion is on the list to be killed. Nate's brothers are on the list to be killed. So here's the next incident that happens. Tell you a little bit about how the Stock Growers Association is preparing for something that you just, if you've never heard this story before, you just won't believe what they did. You've met Frank Walcott already. You know about him. This is the man that inspired the pamphlet, The Jack of Spades. All right, he's got a friend, Billy Irvine. He's a hot-headed, tough man who likes to fight. He is the treasurer of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And together, they come up with a plan to create a private army to go into Johnson County and kill 70 people. Small ranchers, the sheriff, deputies, county commissioners, judges, newspaper editors who had crossed him. This was an incredible thing. It was going to break the Wyoming State Constitution. There's a Section 6, Article 19 in the Constitution of the state that reads this way. Here's just a little section of it. No armed body of men shall ever be brought into this state for the suppression of domestic violence. These two men decide to hire 25 mercenaries from Texas. Tough men who do not mind killing. And they're going to be paid $5 a day and have a bonus of $50 for every killing that they make. That's their plan. So they're going to bring these people in from Texas. They're meeting in Cheyenne. Remember how I've told you these people just have a far reach into the government. They reach also into the railroad, which is a very powerful entity. And they give orders to the Northern Pacific Railroad to run a special train for them to carry these mercenaries from Cheyenne to Casper. And along with them come horses, wagons, food, ammunition, dynamite, everything they're going to need to wreak havoc on the small rancher. They get to Casper, and by the way, nobody knows about this train that's coming in. They do all their boarding and detraining in the dark so that citizens will not know, so that no messages can be sent to Buffalo. Their idea is to go into Buffalo and basically take over the town. It's an insurrection, what they're planning. And it's being done by the most prominent and powerful men in the state. Nate now stays in the Nolan cabin at the KC Ranch. It does not exist anymore, so there's no way I could give you a photograph of that. But I looked through a lot of photographs, and this is one that very much resembles the cabin that Nate stayed in. So now he is there with a new buddy named Nick Ray. Nick's working for him. So Nate's running his cattle here, still in the hole-in-the-wall area. And a bad snowstorm comes in April. And Nate happens to run across two old cowhands who were in the mountains trying to make a living as trappers. And with the weather turned so bad, he invites them to come stay. And they take him up on it. So we've got 4 men in this cabin now. That evening, who shows up there but Mike Chauncey, the stock grower's spy. And he asked Nate, he's an enemy of Nate's, and he asked Nate, can I stay here tonight? I'm not prepared for this weather. And simply out of mercy, Nate lets him in. So now we've got 5 people in that cabin. The next morning, Chauncey gets on his horse and rides off. Nate probably thinks nothing more about him. The following morning, the trappers are still with them. Nick Ray is still there. The following morning, they awake. One of the trappers, an old man named Ben Jones, said, I'm going to go out to the river and get some water. So he takes a pail with him, and he doesn't come back. So the younger trapper, his name is Billy, he's going to go out and look for Ben. Oh, Billy doesn't come back. What nobody knew is that overnight, after Chauncey had ridden off, he had intercepted Walcott's army, which was marching from Casper through a horrible snowstorm. He intercepts Walcott's army and lets Walcott know that Nate Champion is in the cabin at the KC. So Walcott decides to detour his entire original plan, go there first, and get rid of Nate Champion. And here's why. Unknown to Nate, all the small ranchers got together and formed a new organization. It's called the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. And guess who they elected as president? Nate Champion. Nate had no idea this had happened. Walcott had gotten word of this, so Nate Champion became the #1 person on the list to kill. And now we've got these 25 Texans, and we've got 27 members of the Stock Growers Association. Most of these were cowhands who had been hired by the barons, but some went along just to watch. Some of the rich men went along just to kind of watch the fun and see the adventure. In the night, this army had surrounded the cabin where Nate was. And as those two trappers came out, they were simply kidnapped and taken into the barn. Let me show you that barn. That's a look out of the front door of the cabin. This is the real deal now. This is the stable where some livestock was kept, horses were kept. And into that barn, those two trappers were held hostage. Finally, Nick Ray goes out, starts looking for these two guys. Where in the world did they go? And there's one man in this army who is asked to have the privilege of taking the first shot to kill somebody. His name was C.D. Moore. And with this hail of bullets flying into the cabin, trying to hit Nick Ray again, Nate goes out there and starts returning fire and drags Nick Ray inside. Closes the door. Nick is in bad shape. He's been shot several times now. So Nate puts him on a bed, makes him as comfortable as he can, but Nate's also fighting a war at the same time. One man against 50. Nick lived for about 3 hours. Perhaps the most remarkable thing in this story is that during this battle, who knows why, but Nate Champion decided to keep a running diary of what was going on. So his pattern became shoot and write, shoot and write. And that writing has survived. It's probably been tweaked a bit by different people, but we have the basic writing that Nate made in that journal. I'll read you some of it in a little while, but let's get back to this true life action of where he is trapped inside. For 8 hours, he pulls off this army. After about the first 5 of those hours, Nate sees on the road a wagon and a horseman coming along, and he can't recognize who they are. It happens to be Jack Flagg on horseback, and his stepson Alonzo is driving the wagon. Now Jack Flagg is on that list, as you know, the blacklist, and the army around didn't recognize him at first, and as soon as they did, they opened fire on him and his stepson. So Jack Flag and his stepson take off across the bridge and head out of there. And now they know what's going on. They know that Nate's cabin is surrounded. So Texans take off after them on horseback. The Texans take off quickly. They don't carry their rifles. They just have their pistols holstered at their sides. And they are about to catch up to Jack Flag because one of the horses in the wagon team has been shot and is dying. So Jack has his stepson stop the wagon, and they cut out the horse that's not wounded so that the stepson can get on and ride bareback. And while the son is doing that, the Texans arrive. Well, Jack stands in the back of the wagon with his Winchester rifle and lets them know that he's ready for them. And they don't have rifles, so they stand back 1,000 yards and shoot their pistols at him, which is not a way to be accurate with a handgun. So they eventually turn around. They're not going to approach with that rifle in hand, in Jack Flag's hand. So they turn around and go back, give him time to get away, and then they come pick up that wagon because they've got an idea how they can use that wagon against Nate Champion. It's called a Go Devil. You can see it's a moving fortress for people to hide behind. So Walcott's army builds a Go Devil with this wagon. This is not the Go Devil, it's a Go Devil. And they fill this with split fence posts. Now, probably all they would have had for fence posts in the area coming off the slopes would have been mostly pines and junipers. And boy, do those set up a blaze. Those are very volatile fuels. So they loaded hay and those split fence posts into this, and they had about 20 men pushing this thing in. And they push it right up to the cabin. And they're protected because they've got that wall built in front. And Nate doesn't have a chance to shoot at anybody there. So Nate now knows that they plan to burn him out. And they start that fire. The fire takes hold of the cabin. And it must have been just hellacious being in that cabin. Nate took it as long as he could. He really only had a few choices of what to do. He could surrender and be hung, and his body would hang as a way to show others you better not mess with the big cattle barons. He could commit suicide. He could burn up in the fire. That, in my mind, would be a very tough decision there. Or he could make a run for it. That's the only one that had any hope. So he decided he would run at night, but they lit this thing before dark. And the cabin was going to burn up before dark. So Nate eventually had to make a run for it. He took off his boots. He carried a rifle in one hand, a pistol in the other. And then he waited for his opening. He wasn't sure what that was going to be, probably. But the opening came this way. The wind shifted. The wind came out of the north and pushed all the black smoke. You ever burned a lot of pine logs? That's a lot of black smoke. It blew it right into the backyard of the cabin. So that's when Nate made his run. He ran through that smoke. He got about halfway and somebody yelled out, "There he goes!" And then everybody opened up on him. And Nate was not hit. He was fast. His goal was to get to a ravine that was full of brush. And he thought, if I could just get into there, maybe I could crawl out of there and get away from all this. And as soon as he got to the ravine, he saw two men sitting there waiting on him. And so they shot him. And right away, he took about 20 more hits. Nate Champion is dead. All the men come, they want to see who this guy is. They had all learned to respect his accuracy. Nate had hit at least 3 men during the siege. They stood around, and as they did, Frank Walcott, remember him, the Jack of Spades, said this over Nate's corpse: "By God, if I had 50 men like him, I could whip the entire state of Wyoming." That may be the one thing I've ever heard from Frank Walcott's mouth that I actually like. Someone wrote on a piece of paper, "Thieves beware." And they pinned it on Nate's vest, and when they did, they discovered Nate's journal and pulled it out. Frank Walcott read it to everybody around, and it was dead quiet. To hear this man write during this siege of what he was enduring. I would doubt that there was a man there, unless maybe it was Mike Chauncey, who didn't have a lot of respect for the man lying there on the ground before them. The last words that Nate wrote in his journal were, "Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again." This is a wonderful sculpture done by Michael Thomas, and it's called Nate's Last Run. Nate's diary was published in the newspaper. A newspaperman ran off with the diary. He was a real conniving guy. He had come all the way from Chicago. He worked for the Tribune. He'd come all the way just to be a part of this piece of history. He wanted to ride with his army. He had heard about it through an interesting channel. It's a long story. I won't bother you with it. But he made a long trip to join him, and he finagled that diary away from Walcott somehow, took it back and published it. It has certainly been tweaked and edited in some ways. Certainly there were names struck out. You know, Nate must have recognized someone and written their name down. That was struck out. But it was not put in the paper as a tribute to Nate like this is. It was put in the paper as a warning to other so-called rustlers. Well, the finale of this happened at the TA Ranch. Remember that Jack Flagg and his stepson discovered what was going on and they got away. Well, they reported it to Buffalo. And the citizens of Buffalo were enraged that Nate Champion had been killed. One man, whose name was Foote, ran a dry goods store. He opened up his store to anybody who wanted to come in and get weapons and ammunition. We're going to go avenge Nate Champion. So they formed an army there of about 300. And they went marching toward Frank Walcott's army of 50. And they caught them here at the TA Ranch. This ranch is famous for still showing its bullet holes all over the front of this barn. There's the main house there. One of the Walcott's army got through the surrounding Buffalo Citizens Army and got the word to the governor that we're in trouble here. Our army of insurrectionist barons are in trouble. They're about to be killed by the Buffalo citizens. So the governor sends a telegram to Washington and gets the president's staff to wake up the president and send an issue to Fort McKinney to send the cavalry to save Walcott's army. It's the most ludicrous example of the cavalry coming to the rescue, I think, in American history. They came here to save the people who had been the insurrectionists themselves. So the army does. There's the governor. And this is the official surrender, where Walcott's army was willing to give over their arms, but they're under one condition, that they had to go to the fort to be taken care of, and that's exactly what happened. After this, no one was held accountable. No one was indicted and brought to trial and found guilty of anything. Very few hearings were even made. And these men wanted to have a photograph of themselves. And a lot of the people I've just mentioned to you are here in this photograph. Let me see if I can find some here. Frank Kenton, Frank Walcott, the Jack of Spades, Billy Irvine, his treasurer, Mike Chauncey, the spy. All these men lived through this to tell their version of the story. One of the Texans felt so ashamed at what he had done that he wrote up the story himself. His name was George Tucker. Let me read you one or two sentences that he wrote. We were in Wyoming as paid assassins of the big ranchers. We were brought there to murder men in violation of the law. Let no one mislead you by saying that we had the law on our side. We had the politics and the money, but not the law. We were not convicted of our crime. There are lots of tributes to Nate Champion. I just can't believe that I'm the first person to write a book about it. I can't fathom that. Because I see this as one of the greatest last stands in history. And the character of Nate Champion is you have to say, is admirable. These are plaques that talk about him. But here's one of the tributes that's my favorite. This was said by the pastor over the graves of Nate Champion and Nick Ray. These are his words. These two men are now with our Maker, no doubt given a hero's welcome by all who hail from Wyoming. We know Nate and Nick were good men. Far from criminal, they were peace-loving men who by their example inspired the best of who we are. This morning, I overheard 3 different women profess to their children, quote, if you can live up to the likes of Nate Champion, you will make a mother proud and leave your mark. Thank you. Does anyone have any question you'd like to ask about it?
I have a question. There's that movie about Nate Champion. Was it pretty accurate, do you think?
Well, there have been a few movies that include Nate Champion. One is called The Invasion of Johnson County.
Yeah.
And it's quite an old movie. It's about made in the 60s, I think.
Well, Burt Reynolds was in it.
Oh, that's called the Johnson County War.
Oh, okay.
No, there was, it's just a hint of history there. But Nate Champion is not even mentioned in that movie. The first movie to really put Nate Champion's name out into the world was called Heaven's Gate. Anybody ever heard of it? A beautiful movie, well done, that lost more money than any movie in history up to that point. The director, Michael Cimino, I think that was his last movie because he lost so much money. Very artful movie. But the crazy thing about it is, Nate Champion is in that movie. But they give Nate Champion the personality and the action and the deeds of Frank Kenton. The man who had been a criminal in Texas and changed his name and became an assassin. It doesn't make any sense at all. They just wanted to use his name in there, and they just gave it to the wrong character. It's crazy. Well, if you're not too tired of sitting, I have something else to offer you if you're interested. I'm a composer of music, and I've written a song about Nate Champion. And we're set up here to do it. And I guess whether you like it or not. Here I go.
Mark, do you have enough light?
I do. There we go. The name of this is Goodbye, Boys, If I Never See You Again. I left my folks in Texas to find my way up to Heaven's Gate. It's all I've ever wanted, and I found it beneath the Wyoming sky. A place I can call my own, a place for to build me a home. My name has stood for something, but now they call me a rustler. There ain't one calf that I've stolen, and I told them, but they don't wanna hear. Well, I was taught better than that, to know the good from the bad in a man. So try and take me, you'll never break me, because I know I'm in the right. I hear you trying with all your lying to make me out a thief in the night. So keep your distance and mind your business. You can be sure I'll mind my own. But if you cheat me, try to defeat me, you'll have a fight that cuts to the bone. I've never claimed more than what's mine. No, I've never crossed over that line. As much Wyoming as any man to set foot here. But if you try and buy me out or pry me out, you'll find I'm a man of my word. But by then it might be too late, 'cause you know there'll be hell to pay. So try and take me, God won't forsake me, but I could surely use a friend. I'm feeling lonely because I'm only just one man against 50 men. And if they take me, incinerate me, and let my ashes blow to the wind, remember my voice, I'll say goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. Now I'll say goodbye to my friends, if I never see you again. tonight, folks.
Mark, tell them a little bit about your other book.
Well, I am just about a full-time writer now, and I've been studying the West, the American West, for 70 years now. And my first interest was Wyatt Earp, and so I delved deeply into that. I've been fortunate enough to meet all of the great researchers in the field. And when you get into one Western subject, you're going to get led into another soon. And so Billy the Kid became another favorite topic of mine, and now Nate Champion. I've got pure fiction books that are Western. They're literary fiction, so I don't want to mislead you. It's not a shoot 'em up Western. That's called Indigo Heaven. That was my very first novel to get published. And I've got a memoir of 2 years that I lived in a teepee during the time that I was teaching Native American skills to students. That's called 2 Winters in a Teepee. And two of the greatest years of my life, simply because it put me at the main intersection of nature. I lived in the woods full time, and that's how you get to see the things that maybe you see once or twice in your life, when you visit the woods. I also have one of my favorite books that I've written, and I was so pleased that it won me that honor of a Georgia Author of the Year back in 2022. It's called Song of the Horseman, and it's about a Cherokee horse trainer. I also have a book that has a guarantee with it. It comes with a warranty. You ever had a book with a warranty? If you read the book and you don't laugh out loud at least once, you'll get your money back. Send me the book back. Send your money back. It's called The Western Trail Travesties. And I like its subtitle even better. 5 little-known stories of the Old West that probably ought to have stayed that way. And one of my latest books, besides the Nate Champion books, is a book on the reversal of the Trail of Tears. It's called The Moon of the White Tears. And it's about my area where I come from in North Georgia in the mountains. And it's a story about a very interesting collection of people who get together in modern times. And I don't want to give the whole thing away, but there is a unique reversal of the Trail of Tears in it. The Nate Champion books are a duology, 2 books. The first one tells the story of Nate in Texas, and the second one tells the story in Wyoming. It's not a necessity that you read this book before that one. I got a feeling you're going to be more interested in that one. But they do go together well, but they're written in such a way that starting off with this one is fun. So I hope you'll come up and take a look at the books, and I'll be here to answer any questions you might have about it. Thanks again for coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Check out the books. Have a good night.